Welcome. Thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar. Just giving a few seconds to make sure everyone is able to join. I see participants numbers increasing, which is great to see. All right, we can get started. Before we start, a few technical notes. You've all been muted, but we encourage you to type out your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll reserve some time at the end of the webinar for questions. Today, we're very pleased to speak with you about Root Capital's work to combat climate change and to be joined by IKEA Foundation, a valued thought partner and supporter of our climate change work. Recently, here at Root, we've been all hands on deck to respond to COVID-19, leveraging our lending, advisory services, and partnerships to help hundreds of agricultural businesses adapt quickly to both the health and the economic impacts. I'm sure you've seen some of the information in our newsletters, and you can also find more information on our COVID response on our website. COVID-19 is a very challenging shock for rural communities, one that will likely reverberate for years to come. But at the same time, we haven't lost sight of the existential threat of climate change. Smallholder farmers, some of the least responsible for climate change, are among those most vulnerable to its impacts. Droughts, floods, and temperature swings are already a reality in farming communities and are only predicted to worsen, threatening the livelihoods of hundreds of millions around the world. In the face of this threat, Root Capital is excited to announce our new strategy for helping communities thrive, our Climate Resilience Roadmap. We'll have two speakers today, my colleague Elizabeth Teague, Associate Director of Social and Environmental Performance at Root Capital, and Nico Janssen, Program Manager for Agricultural Livelihoods at IKEA Foundation. Elizabeth leads Root Capital's Climate Resilience Initiative and oversees impact measurement and management for our lending activities. Nico is a Program Manager for Agricultural Livelihoods at the IKEA Foundation. That's the philanthropic arm of INGKA, the largest franchise holder of the IKEA brand. Nico started about a year and a half ago at IKEA after a 20-year career as a field implementer of agricultural development programs in, among other places, Tanzania, Cambodia, Vietnam. Nico currently lives with his family in the Netherlands, where the IKEA Foundation office is located. Thank you for joining us today, Nico. During the first half of our time today, Elizabeth and Nico will talk about why the issue of climate change is so important to our collective work to improve rural livelihoods, and about how Root Capital and the IKEA Foundation are working to build a more climate resilient future. We'll leave about 20 minutes at the end to answer your questions. Please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box as we go along. And over to Elizabeth. And you're muted, Elizabeth.
Sorry about that, thank you. Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you again to everyone joining us. Today, I'm very pleased to talk about Root Capital's work to address climate change. I'll start with why we're launching a new climate strategy now and what we're hoping to achieve over the coming years. As Amy mentioned, climate change is having very real, very devastating impacts today. In the United States, these impacts are very top of mind as we see the images of the unprecedented wildfires on the West Coast. Our thoughts go out to anyone joining us from California, Oregon, or Washington. And at Root Capital, we're seeing those impacts every day among the smallholder farmers and businesses with whom we work. So I'd like to start there with the people on the front lines of our changing climate. Meet Maria Elena, a coffee farmer in Nicaragua. Maria has been farming coffee for decades on about 2 hectares or 5 acres of land, which she and her family manage as a mini forest with a diverse mix of coffee trees, fruit trees, and shade trees. Thanks to the number of trees on her land, Maria's farm sequesters or draws down from the atmosphere more carbon each year than it emits, meaning that Maria's farm is helping reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. Maria's coffee farm serves as her family's main source of income, but now she wonders whether her children will follow her as coffee farmers. Because in recent years, Maria has seen the weather change, making coffee production more difficult. About 7 years ago, climate change contributed to an unprecedented outbreak of a coffee disease called coffee leaf rust that killed around 40% of her coffee trees, slashing her income that year and for years to come. More recently, rising temperatures and decreased rains have resulted in droughts, causing her coffee trees to wilt and produce smaller coffee cherries. Here's a photo of a bridge over a dried up riverbed during one such drought in Nicaragua. As a result, Maria is seeing her coffee yields and income fall. She worries about making enough money each year to cover farm costs and feed her family. If conditions don't improve, Maria and her family may have no choice but to migrate in search of a better future. Maria is just one of 500 million small farmers, including 12 million coffee farmers, whose livelihoods are threatened by climate change. Agricultural businesses across Root Capital's global portfolio report climate change as a real and present danger, citing prolonged heat waves and drought in Central America's coffee lands, more frequent and more severe El Niño and La Niña events in East Africa, unseasonal rains and strong winds in the South American Andes, and rising temperatures and shorter growing seasons in West Africa. The World Bank predicts that these and other effects of climate change could push an additional 100 million people in low and middle income countries into poverty over the next 10 years, reversing progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. If they cannot adapt to the changes ahead, farmers like Maria face wrenching choices: watch their farms fail, resort to environmentally destructive practices to make ends meet, like encroachment into more fertile protected areas, or migrate. Despite these urgent threats and smallholder farmers' importance to global food systems, ecosystem conservation, and climate action, the world has been slow to support smallholder communities. Today, for example, only around 4% of global climate finance goes towards agriculture, leaving rural communities largely to fend for themselves. As a global community, this is our decade to turn the tide against climate change. The United Nations estimates we have about 10 years until 2030 to halve global carbon emissions and avoid a climate catastrophe. And while we work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we must also begin the process of adapting to our new reality, because climate change is already here, particularly for smallholder farmers like Maria. In the words of the Global Commission on Adaptation, led by the former Secretary General of the UN and co-chaired by Bill Gates and the Managing Director of the IMF, deferring adaptation will result in a huge human and economic toll, while adaptation done right will lead to better growth and development, protecting nature, reducing inequalities, and creating opportunities. Here, I'd like to pass the mic to Nico to talk a little bit more about how the IKEA Foundation also thinks about this global mandate for climate action. Over to you, Nico.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lizzie and Amy, for inviting us, the IKEA Foundation, to join in this important webinar, and thanks to all the participants for joining. At the IKEA Foundation, we are driven by the double objective of improving livelihoods while at the same time preserving or improving the environment, work that sits very much at the intersection of agricultural livelihoods and climate action. Especially now, as we're facing both this 10-year deadline to dramatically cut greenhouse gas emissions and seeing the vulnerability of rural communities in the face of COVID and other crises. We see that we can't wait to adapt to climate change. We need to keep our full focus and commitment on both the mitigation and adaptation fronts. According to the Eat Lancet Commission, global food production threatens climate stability and ecosystem resilience and represents the single largest driver of environmental degradation. The International Food Policy Research Institute cautions that agricultural intensification, if done incorrectly, depletes soils and pollutes groundwater. There's growing evidence that healthy soil is essential to grow healthy crops, increase food productivity, and even sequester carbon to mitigate climate change. But producers cannot just do this on their own. They need supportive systems around them that help them get through this crucial transition. A productive and regenerative system, as identified by the Food and Land Use Coalition in their Growing Better report. Together with our partners, we are working on identifying pathways towards planet and climate positive agriculture, a new agri-food system that can deliver sustainable livelihoods for smallholders, as well as contribute to protecting the planet and restore ecosystem services. We're encouraged by this increasing momentum towards climate action and hope that these next 10 years really can be the moment we come together as a global community to address the climate change crisis. And back to you, Lizzie.
Great, thank you so much, Nico. So against this backdrop, Root Capital is very pleased to share our commitment to double down on climate action with rural communities. This work centers on our partnership with hundreds of agricultural enterprises around the world. Through our decades of work in rural communities, we've seen firsthand the climate-related risks to farmer livelihoods, and we've seen how agricultural enterprises can be powerful champions of climate action for these communities. These businesses, such as cooperatives and associations, agro-processors, and aggregators, are rooted within local communities, attuned to and invested in local needs for the long term. Indeed, they are often anchors in vulnerable places where government institutions, civil society, and other businesses are weak or non-existent. They provide farmers with access to better livelihoods and critical support services like agronomic training and microcredit that can build farmer resilience to climate change. Individually, each farmer-allied business impacts the lives of hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of farmers. Collectively, they serve as a distributed platform for grassroots, locally determined, and timely climate action at scale. But these businesses can't do this important work alone, especially given the recent shocks buffeting rural communities, of which COVID-19 pandemic is only the latest. Many agricultural businesses remain vulnerable to market and natural disruptions, one shock away from closing their doors. In the face of climate change and other shocks like COVID-19, Root Capital is redoubling our efforts to build agricultural enterprises' resilience. What do we mean by resilience? We mean essentially the ability to manage disruption, adapt, and even thrive in the face of shocks. Under this definition, resilience is not a state of being, but rather a set of capacities that enable farmers, businesses, or entire communities to not simply bounce back from shocks like crop disease outbreaks or COVID, but bounce forward into a reimagined, more sustainable, inclusive, and prosperous future. After 20 years proving the bankability of agricultural businesses, our next horizon is to ensure business bankability and resilience. Over the next 5 years, Root Capital will work with our clients to build their resilience to climate change and other shocks to ensure these businesses remain sustainable engines of impact with their communities for years to come. Today, we're pleased to share our strategy to realize this next horizon, our climate resilience roadmap. The roadmap describes 4 key pathways to achieve our vision of climate resilient businesses and communities, leveraging our proven credit plus capacity model, as well as key partnerships. First, grow our lending to businesses committed to climate action in rural communities. Second, cultivate business and farmer capacity to adapt to climate change. Third, innovate financial solutions to unlock local investment in climate action. And finally, amplify successful climate solutions to encourage adoption and replication by others. I'll walk through each pathway in turn, noting the scale of our ambitions and providing some examples along the way. First, grow. Through our lending activities, Root Capital finances businesses on the front lines of climate change who are driving climate action in their communities. We call these businesses climate action leaders. We identify and prioritize climate action leaders through our impact monitoring efforts, looking for businesses that engage in some of the climate action activities listed on this slide, like reforestation, providing climate adaptation training for farmers, or helping farmers reduce or transfer climate risk through programs like weather insurance. Many of these businesses use or promote promising natural climate solutions, efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by conserving or restoring forests, grasslands, and wetlands. For example, around 40% of our clients in 2019 supported reforestation initiatives. Around 40% also sourced from diverse agroforestry farms that keep trees on the landscape and store carbon. Recent research by the Nature Conservancy and others indicates that these natural climate solutions can provide up to 37% of the emissions reductions needed by 2030 to keep global temperature increases under 2 degrees Celsius, 30% more than previously estimated, making natural climate solutions a key tool in the fight against climate change. One example of a climate action leader in our portfolio is Coop Libertad, a coffee cooperative with over 2,000 members in the Central Valley of Costa Rica. The cooperative connects farmers to international certified markets that offer higher prices for their coffee, provides farmers with technical assistance and microloans to improve their farms, and provides access to coffee seedlings, as you can see here. In terms of climate action, Coop Libertad works to both mitigate climate change and prepare farmers for climate shocks. The cooperative participates in Costa Rica's low carbon coffee initiative, with commitments to reduce its direct carbon footprint through improvements in the energy efficiency of its processing equipment. Coop Libertad also helps farmers prepare for climate change by providing organic compost to build soil health and carbon and ultimately resilience, and by offering ongoing training on best farming practices to deal with increasing weather variability. Last year, we provided almost 100 million in financing to 125 climate action leaders like Coop Libertad. Collectively, these businesses reached over 500,000 farming families, stewarding over 500,000 hectares, well over 1 million acres across 3 continents. These agribusinesses need ongoing access to capital to grow, mature, and thrive, and yet many remain locked out of commercial financial markets. 70% of the climate action leaders who received a root capital loan in 2019 did not have access to a similar loan from a commercial source, like a local bank. 42% did not have access to a similar loan from any other source. By 2025, we aim to increase our lending to climate action leaders by over 50%. We'll achieve this growth both by adding new climate action leaders to our lending portfolio and by cultivating the capacity of existing borrowers to engage in more intensive climate action through our Climate Resilience Advisory Service. Which is a good segue to our next pathway, cultivating business and farmer capacity to adapt to climate change. Here, we will use our advisory services to build clients' climate resilience through a menu of complementary services, some delivered directly by Root Capital, others through partners. As a quick refresher to those newer to Root Capital, our advisory program provides technical assistance to businesses in the form of customized, demand-driven support that evolves as businesses grow and mature. We provide advisory on a range of critical business areas, including financial management, governance, digital business intelligence, and most recently, COVID crisis response. Several years ago, we started to see that clients needed more than just capital to prepare for climate change. They needed information on how climate change will likely impact their business and guidance on how to prepare. Many clients simply didn't have access to any kind of climate change training. If clients did have access, the training tended to focus on on-farm agronomic best practices, without enough emphasis on commercial dynamics shaping business and farmer decision-making. Or training was often offered as one-time sessions without the follow-up needed to address the ongoing, evolving nature of the climate crisis. So we decided to launch a new line of advisory services to address these gaps, a climate resilience advisory service that would take a whole business approach to climate action planning, considering market dynamics, businesses' financial realities, and agroclimatic conditions. We designed the service to accompany enterprises over multiple years and leverage the best available climate data from partners to create actionable plans with rural businesses. To bring this work alive, I'd like to provide 2 examples, returning once more to Nicaragua and then turning to Rwanda. Our climate resilience advisory typically starts with an assessment of climate risk and vulnerability. We hold climate vulnerability workshops with clients to help each business understand its unique vulnerability to climate change based on its physical exposure to climate change risk on the one hand and capacity to respond to those risks on the other. Last year, our advisory team hosted one such workshop with 4 coffee cooperatives in Nicaragua, including Flor de Café, the cooperative to which Maria, whom I introduced at the beginning, belongs. To determine climate risk exposure, we used local climate risk maps specific to coffee, provided by our technical partner, the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, or CIAT. You can see such a risk map here. The map shows the projected suitability of coffee production in Nicaragua around 2050, based on global climate models. Areas in red are projected to become unsuitable for Arabica coffee production, while areas in orange or yellow are projected to remain suitable if farmers can adapt their farming practices. We plotted cooperative members against this climate risk map using farm coordinates collected via other Root Capital advisory services. We then used other farmer data, like current use of climate-friendly agricultural practices, to assess farmers' likely capacity to respond to their level of climate risk. Based on this information, we could start to identify targeted adaptation options for each client for further discussion during subsequent one-on-one advisory engagements. One of the things that really excites us about this service is that it's informed by data on clients' farmers, collected by clients themselves with support from our advisory team. We've seen that having access to this data on local realities is key to moving climate change planning from conversation mode into action mode, because climate risk and adaptation are so context specific. To give an example, when we mapped the 1,200 farmer members of these 4 coffee cooperatives in Nicaragua, we found that climate risk exposure varied in meaningful ways. 2 of the cooperatives had fairly concentrated membership bases, mostly in the yellow risk category at lower altitudes, where rising temperatures are causing problems for coffee. Another cooperative had a very distributed membership, with farmers across all 3 risk zones. And the 4th cooperative had members farming at much higher altitudes who appear to be at risk not from rising temperatures, but from strong winds that can damage coffee trees and coffee beans. All to say that even within a relatively small area of this part of Nicaragua, climate risk can look very different for different communities, requiring different responses. By combining farmer data with climate science from technical partners, we can have a much richer, much more informed conversation with our clients about how to build resilience to climate change. Now let's turn to Rwanda, where our work looks a little different. Here, we're focusing our climate resilience advisory efforts on building clients' capacity to provide real-time technical assistance to farmers that reflects changing weather conditions, a critical tool to build farmer and ultimately business resilience to climate change and variability. With the support of the IKEA Foundation and in partnership with Precision Agriculture for Development, we're piloting a digital intervention that complements traditional extension models, such as farmer field schools and farm visits, with regular text alerts tailored to observe local weather conditions. For example, the messages might remind farmers that it's time to fertilize their coffee, or might alert farmers to implement water-saving measures if their region is experiencing a dry period. These messages are designed to amplify the impact of cooperatives' technical assistance teams, enabling businesses to reach their thousands of farmers every few weeks, as opposed to a few times a year, and to respond to emerging weather conditions. We're currently wrapping up an evaluation to understand the impacts of this service to inform future work, so please stay tuned for results. Now, Nico, as we've worked together on this pilot in Rwanda, we've talked a lot about the potential of digital solutions for smallholder agriculture. So I'd love to hear more from you what opportunities you're seeing to use digital tools to build resilience to climate change and other shocks. Why does the Foundation see digital agricultural services as an important tool in the climate action toolbox?
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie, for that question. And indeed, a very interesting topic. How can we reach producers, and especially those living a bit further away from urbanized centers, with good quality services? From the work we support in East Africa and India, we see that many rural households are indeed not reached by traditional extension or other knowledge and information services. Many farmers have to face the future and the uncertainty in the future with knowledge of the past, and this needs to change. And to be able to reach the majority of those farmers, the way in which extension services are provided needs to change as well. And many different models and applications are being tested. And where this was in the past mostly seen as a government or public responsibility, extension services are nowadays more and more seen as an integrated service by value chain actors. And we see all kinds of models of farm advisors, input providers who offer services, product buyers with additional services, etc. And we are at the Foundation supporting a number of promising models, among others, of course, the ones you mentioned in Rwanda with you. And with the growing coverage of mobile data services in rural areas, why not make use of these digital services to farmers who can get much more accurate and timely advice on essential data such as weather forecasts, pests and diseases, or other forms of cropping advice. And in this way, services can also be made much more location specific so that unnecessary and costly measures can be avoided. But also in a more proactive way in which smallholders and their cooperatives can use digital services to get access to markets or finance, and where farmers can let market players know that they have a product to sell or demonstrate their track record to financiers. Digital services can be used in all these ways. And the focus, as demonstrated by Root Capital also, but also other partners, shows that these services need to be complementary to other extension services. Agriculture remains a profession of people interacting with other people and their natural conditions. And this cannot be replaced by technology alone, but technology can and needs to play a bigger role supporting the smallholders in making the right and timely decisions. Back to you, Lizzie.
Great, thank you, Nico, for offering that perspective. So as of the end of 2019, we had field tested climate resilience advisory with 13 enterprises reaching over 25,000 farmers, stewarding about 25,000 hectares in Central America and East Africa. Over the next 5 years, we plan to refine and scale this service to clients across our global operations with an ambition to build the climate resilience of at least 125 businesses representing approximately 150,000 farmers. Our third pathway is innovate financial solutions to unlock scaled investment in climate action. As climate change unfolds, as businesses and farmers gain a better understanding of the climate risks they face and of potential adaptation pathways, they will need to make new investments. Businesses, for example, may need to invest in more energy efficient equipment or new business lines should they decide to diversify into more climate ready crops. Farmers will need to invest in more climate resilient farming practices, which may require new equipment, inputs, or labor. Yet smallholder businesses and their suppliers largely lack access to the capital to make these climate action investments. As we mentioned earlier, despite significant global commitments around climate finance, despite the recognized importance of agriculture in confronting climate change, only around 4% of climate finance goes to agriculture, and only a fraction of that funding flows to smallholder farmers or allied businesses. Why? One of the reasons, simply put, is that working with smallholder communities remains very challenging. Particularly on the finance side, small deal sizes, high transaction costs, and high risk relative to other sectors already limit the flow of capital to smallholder agriculture. Increasing risk and uncertainty tied to climate change only compound this long-standing market failure. The result is an enormous climate finance gap for agriculture, estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year. Root Capital seeks to apply our leadership in designing and deploying blended finance solutions to help close this gap. Specifically, we plan to blueprint and test financial products and funding models to downscale these multi-billion-dollar climate finance commitments into right-sized, affordable capital for smallholder enterprises. When we say financial products, we will consider products along the blended finance spectrum, from philanthropy to loans. On the lending side, we see great potential in applying modified forms of our current loan products, like lines of credit, to finance climate-related investments. In particular, we're hearing demand from businesses for loans for fertilizers, which build soil health and carbon, helping combat climate change while increasing crop yields. Businesses often struggle to finance fertilizers themselves, as farmers need fertilizers before the harvest season, when businesses are most strapped for cash as they need the harvest to receive payment from their customers. In 2021, we're planning on dispersing several million in pre-harvest fertilizer loans to a select number of clients. These loans will generally follow climate resilience advisory services designed to help businesses select fertilizers and other soil amendments based on their farmers' unique needs. We seek to scale from there. And over the next 5 years, we'll explore additional climate loan products like loans for equipment to improve the carbon footprint or resilience of our clients. As a complement to our lending, we see an important role for targeted philanthropy in the form of small grants, generally in the range of $25,000 to $50,000, where climate action investments don't make economic sense as a loan. To simplify a bit, some climate investments won't generate sufficient short-term returns for borrowers, who would then struggle to afford even modest interest rates. Others will be so small that Root Capital would spend more money on loan administration than we would earn in interest, making a grant more cost-effective. Here, we'll leverage our existing Resilience Grants program, which we've used to finance business investments in gender equity and recently COVID emergency response. While smaller in scale, these targeted grants will be critical to financing climate action without unduly burdening or over-indebting vulnerable communities. Root Capital enters into this innovation agenda with a decade of experience designing and testing loans to support climate mitigation and adaptation. Since 2010, we've piloted loans for clean technology and farm renovation, or the replanting of perennial tree crops like coffee, dispersing over $8 million. We disperse most of this capital through a public-private partnership called the Coffee Farm Resilience Initiative a sector-leading emergency mobilization of funds in response to a coffee disease outbreak in Latin America. More information about this initiative is available in the publications section of our website. Over the next 5 years, we seek to scale promising climate finance products within our own portfolio of 200 plus borrowers, reaching more than 665,000 farmers. And we also commit to sharing lessons to amplify our direct impact beyond our own factory gates, which leads me to our final pathway. Knowing that no one organization can solve this massive global problem, we will amplify successful climate solutions to encourage adoption and replication by others. We have experience doing this as well. Over the last 20 years, we've helped build the industry of smallholder agricultural finance, showing the world that agricultural enterprises are bankable and attracting hundreds of millions of dollars to rural communities. Now, we want to help direct some of this capital to climate action in these communities by building the impact case for agricultural enterprises as local agents of climate action, as we've talked about today, blueprinting models for building the climate resilience of these businesses through a combination of capital and capacity building, and sharing our learning broadly with global climate action practitioners and funders. Here, we plan on both leveraging existing partners and building new ones, whether they be climate researchers, certifiers, private sector leaders, impact investors, or global climate funders. On this side, you can see some examples of partners who have been instrumental in our work to date and with whom we look forward to working with in the future. One of those partners is, of course, the IKEA Foundation, who helped launch our climate resilience work in East Africa in particular. Nico, one of the things that initially brought our two organizations together is our common orientation towards climate action in partnership with rural communities, towards work that both recognizes climate change as an urgent threat to rural livelihoods and recognizes the important role of rural communities in the fight against our global climate crisis. To wrap us up today, I'd love to hear more from you about the Foundation's perspective on climate action and rural livelihoods and what's motivating you in this fight going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie. As I mentioned at the start also, we at the IKEA Foundation are driven by this double objective of preserving and improving livelihoods and the environment. Now, work that sits at the intersection of agriculture, livelihoods, and climate action. And we think and believe that agriculture is a great sector of growth and innovation, where farmers and entrepreneurs together are the creators, change agents, and leaders of the coming decades. And with rapid urbanization, as we can now see, for instance, also on the African continent, the need for sustainably produced and healthy food and provision to cities will only increase. And that's why we want to regenerate the agricultural landscape. So farming and agribusiness are seen also by the next generation as a viable and noble career option that not only feeds the world, but also enables people to afford a better life for themselves and their families. Growing the world's food should be something people aspire to, not simply for altruistic reasons, but for a very practical one, because it financially supports them, their families, and their communities. But profitability cannot come at the expense of the planet that sustains us. So we take a planet-positive approach to agriculture, with agriculture both contributing to and being affected by climate change. We prioritize agriculture that regenerates resources, protects ecosystems, and enhances biodiversity. And here again, farmers and their families, locally in the form of agriculture businesses and globally in the form of organizations like Root Capital, will be so critical to building that resilience to climate change, so agriculture can be a force for positive change in the world. But equally, we believe that we need to look at critical aspects of circularity. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation, one of our partners, has demonstrated in their studies that only fractions of urban organic waste is recycled and returned to the farmers' fields. This is a hugely missed opportunity that we want to further explore as part of our planet-positive agriculture approach. Again, identifying pathways towards planet-positive agriculture is a key issue for us at the IKEA Foundation. And we see that agriculture businesses will be and are key players to drive climate action, or at least to play a front-runner role. I've seen it for myself also in Kenya, coffee farmers who are uprooting their coffee at the moment as it's no longer profitable. Of course, this Also may open up opportunities for other products as diversification, but each time the full risk and burden is on the smallholder farmers, who already have very limited margins and economic space to make these investments. Enterprises will need to support them. Last year, I was visiting with Root Capital, a macadamia nut processor in Kenya. It was an excellent example of how a local enterprise, together with the producers, can turn things around and drive climate action and social action. It's very good to see that now more and more financiers are making steps, and hopefully big ones. And we especially like and appreciate the combination of supporting enterprises to adjust their models, as well as sharpening financial criteria. Changing finance criteria will be important, but we also have to be willing to support agribusinesses to change their business models to planet positive ones. It's good to see that Root Capital wants to keep on taking that front runner role, and we are proud and pleased to be a partner in that. Thank you, and back to you, Lizzie, again.
And thank you so much, Nico, for your reflections and for your partnership with Root Capital over the years. Really appreciate it. So as you can see, as you've heard today, we have an ambitious road ahead to build the climate resilience of rural communities over the next 5 years. For more information about the details of our climate resilience strategy, including an executive summary of the roadmap and how you could help, please visit rootcapital.org/climate. If you have any programmatic questions, please feel free to send me an email. My email is here on the screen. Or if you're interested in how you can support this work, please send an email to Jessica Lee, our Senior Manager of Philanthropic Initiatives, whose email is also here on the screen. Again, we're grateful for the partnership of so many organizations and individuals in this work, including many on the call today. Your partnership fills us with hope that together we can help turn the tide on climate change and build a more resilient, prosperous future for all. And with that, we'd like to close our comments for today and open it up for your questions and discussion.
Great. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Nico. It would be, I think we have requests for us to for you guys to turn your cameras back on now that we have the Q&A. And we have had some questions coming in, and we're just right on time too, which is really nice. Lizzie, this one I think is going to you. In trying to improve climate resilience among smallholder farmers, will Root's new strategy be to go deeper in our current geographies and regions, or to expand to new geographies?
Thank you for the question. Mostly we're really looking on going deeper in our current geographies. We have a global footprint across Central America, South America, East and West Africa, and in Southeast Asia as well, and Indonesia. And we see, again, great potential to work with those businesses to build their resilience to climate change, given that they're already working in these key geographies. They already have this foothold with over 500,000 smallholder farmers. And so mostly we'll be looking to accompany them over the next couple of years to build their resilience, both on the capital side and through advisory as well.
Great. And also for Lizzie, could you explain how we will find and identify climate action leaders?
Certainly. So for climate action, basically often we're looking at activities that relate on one hand to climate change mitigation, so efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or to sequester carbon, or efforts that relate to climate adaptation and resilience. And so when we try to identify climate action leaders, we're looking at both sides of the issue. And we are collecting information through our ongoing work with clients, particularly our social and environmental due diligence process that we conduct with borrowers, to learn more about what they're already doing on this issue. And so we would look at things like certain certifications, which are a good package of climate-friendly practices in certain contexts, things like improved soil management, improved waste management, some circular agriculture issues like Nico mentioned, around reducing and repurposing organic waste streams. We're looking at commitments around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, again, directly at the business level or in partnership with farmers. And we're particularly looking at efforts that really protect and preserve important forest landscapes, as so many of our clients work in these really critical forest landscapes. And so that's why I highlighted earlier some of these practices around reforestation initiatives, around support for agroforestry farms, because those natural climate solutions are so important for climate action going forward. So we're having those conversations with clients, taking in that data as we go through our lending process, and then kind of running the numbers on the back end to really parse out and prioritize those businesses that we think are going above and beyond on the climate front.
Great. And Nico, this one is for you. Can you say more about your strategies for drawing down and sequestering carbon that can also increase yields and net profitability for farmers?
Yes, thank you for that question. We had as I said, our approach is very much an approach focusing on regenerative farming, in which restoring natural conditions, soil health, organic matter in soils, restoring water retention capacity of soils, increasing biodiversity and ecosystem services on farm, but also at larger areas like landscapes is a crucial way of measuring and managing results and impacts of our projects. And we're asking all our partners also to measure that and report on that. Because we believe that the previous linear approach to harvest, sell, and consume is no longer valid, can no longer be sustained by the planet. And if we want to bring agriculture back within planetary boundaries, we have to come up with new ways of doing and new ways of measuring.
Great. And Lizzie, anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there because one of the things that we're also working on now is we know, particularly for our coffee portfolio, which is the majority of our portfolio, we know that so many of the businesses and farmers with whom we work are already sequestering carbon because of their use of agroforestry practices, because of their low input management practices, et cetera. But we haven't had a way to quantify that. Historically, we just haven't had visibility into every farmer's carbon footprint. And so one of the initiatives that we're really excited about is some work with the Inter-American Development Bank and with Cooperative Coffees and the Cool Farm Alliance and others to actually go to specific farms among some of the clients with whom we work in Latin America and help them measure the carbon footprint of their farms in a way that will basically provide farmers with access to a carbon premium to reward them when they are sequestering carbon, when they are good carbon actors. And so we're really excited about that work with Co-op Coffees and others, because in the short term, it will reward farmers for the good climate work that they're doing that has not been rewarded historically. And it will also give us a lot more information about the carbon footprint and the sequestration rates of part of our portfolio, and we'll be sharing that information with our stakeholders.
Thanks. Oh, there's lots of questions coming in. Let me just parse them. We're parsing them here on the back end to make sure we're touching on everything. Lizzie, I think as you're thinking about this initiative, do you think more time will be spent on cultivating relationships with new partners and maybe new clients also, or growing the capacity with our current partners and clients? It's kind of two separate stakeholders there.
Yeah, I think both. I think both will be really important, and I'm not sure we'll put the emphasis on one more of the other. Certainly in terms of our clients and the businesses with whom we're working in the field, we see that building climate resilience is a long-term journey. It's not something that happens over 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year. And so there's certainly a value to having these long-term relationships with businesses and deepening that over the next 5 years and beyond to really help them build resilience to climate change, particularly as climate change is an evolving crisis. It will look different in 2025 than it does this year. And so we certainly want to go down that pathway, but we're also very interested in bringing new businesses into our portfolio and helping build their capacity. And so we will be looking across both pathways as we pursue our work over the next 5 years.
Okay, thank you. This is getting into maybe a little bit on the technical side of our lending, but how is Root ensuring that loans for the climate action leaders are used for regenerative practices rather than carbon intensive? For example, organic compost rather than chemical fertilizers, and how is that monitored?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And one of the reasons that we see such an important role for advisory, our climate finance work. So I mentioned we want to use climate resilience advisory to, in many ways, set the stage for these lending opportunities to really help businesses formulate a plan about how they want to adapt to climate change, how they want to build resilience. The plan needs to come from the businesses, but then we will have an opportunity to discuss the plan with the business, make sure we're aligned in terms of our common understanding of climate action and what is or is not advancing regenerative practices, for example. And so that will be very important on the front end as we think about basically co-creating financing proposals with clients. And then throughout the life of the loan, we see an important role for one of the advisory services I mentioned very much in passing, but called our Digital Business Intelligence Service, which helps businesses digitize their information flows, particularly information coming from farmers. Very important for things like monitoring certification. We see huge potential there for just continuing to monitor on-farm conditions, again, in partnership with our clients, so that we can start to answer those types of questions. You know, what are farmers investing in? What practices are they using? How are things going for them in terms of productivity, in terms of quality, in terms of disease outbreaks? That will be a really powerful information flow that the businesses and Root Capital use collectively to advance the climate action agenda.
And to mention that in all the countries where we work, we have offices and staff like local loan officers and
Yes.
local advisory services consultants who have these relationships with the clients or in contact now remotely and virtually, but as things get back to normal, again in person and like alongside the businesses and the farmers. Lizzie, you mentioned the potential to help clients gain access to weather insurance. What are the current challenges to providing such access? And for Nico, is this an area of interest to IKEA Foundation?
So yes, we're certainly interested in helping clients access those third-party weather insurance services. What we've seen to date is that in many cases it remains a technical challenge of how do you design an effective, in many cases, weather index insurance product that is also affordable for businesses and farmers and practical to roll out. And so there are various institutions and businesses that are working on this problem. We haven't quite seen the kind of the right solution for our portfolio at scale yet. We've seen some really promising pilots, particularly in East Africa, but that remains, it really remains a technical challenge. And then from there, certainly there will be logistical challenges in terms of scaling it out. And so some of our clients have participated in those pilots and have had some interesting learnings and good successes there. But we continue to see that this is something where, unfortunately, the service really isn't available for the vast majority of our clients right now. So more work needs to be done on the product development side.
And Nico, is weather insurance and access to weather insurance something that IKEA Foundation has looked at or been interested in exploring?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's definitely something that we are following. Of course, IKEA Foundation is not a direct implementer. So in that sense, we work through our partners, and if they are seeing good opportunities to introduce this as a service, we do and we can welcome it. At the same time, our current focus is very much on building the evidence that the planet positive agriculture is positive and makes sense and can gain traction among farmers and enterprises alike, and ultimately, of course, also financiers. Weather insurance, and I think, as Lizzie says, yeah, there's not really examples yet that can be rolled out at scale. is not yet really our focus in that package, but we definitely follow it.
Okay, moving on to some questions that came in around working with youth, and how are we, either both, maybe Nico through some of your partnerships, and Lizzie, of course, in our work, encouraging youth to keep working in agriculture and training them to work sustainably, and kind of what is the role of youth in our climate resilience and in our work overall?
Well, for us at IKEA Foundation, youth is basically that's the bread and butter why we do things, to offer youth a better future outlook in life, and also in our agriculture portfolio, but also in our separate work on employment entrepreneurship. There's a strong focus on youth, and we ask most of our partners to explain to us what they're doing for youth, and also to show a keen understanding what drives youth or what motivates youth to stay in agriculture. Youth is no longer interested, I think, in backbreaking work with hoes in fields. They want to see modernization happening. So we have to keep triggering that and keep thinking about how does that take place. And thanks to partners as Root Capital, who are constantly looking to push these frontiers, we see that youth are staying interested in agriculture and can see and can demonstrate that it can bring them a sustained livelihood.
Yeah, and I would just add that certainly youth and creating opportunities for youth is very important for Root Capital as well beyond our climate work. Our climate work does have a direct impact because, as Nico was saying, we need to make sure that agriculture remains a viable livelihood strategy for the next generation. And so you could say that all of our climate work is working towards that goal. More specifically, we also have a number of advisory programs that work to basically help businesses identify opportunities to be more inclusive of youth. So for example, on the employment side, there are internship placement programs that we're operating in partnership with several partners in East Africa and West Africa, where we're helping young graduates who may not have access to good job opportunities right now receive really targeted professional experience with some of our clients, and as a way to help grow them as young professionals in the agricultural space. And so we're certainly focused on that issue going forward, and it's a thread that unites many of our other impact areas, such as climate.
And Lizzie, kind of recognizing that climate resilience isn't an actual, maybe an end, an end to itself, but a journey and a process and a set of capacities. Do you have an example of kind of a before and after story of working with an agricultural business, kind of before they started instituting and building the capacity, and now that they have built some climate resilience, what they look like?
Yeah, I would say you put it very well, that it's not necessarily a black and white before and after, it is a journey. One of the examples that comes to mind is a few businesses that we work with in Peru, where they're in a region of more central Peru where coffee production had been important, remains important, and yet is really struggling with climate change and changing weather conditions. And several of these coffee cooperatives have helped farmers over the last number of years diversify into cocoa production, because they're seeing that at lower altitudes where it's hotter, in some cases cocoa is a really viable alternative to coffee. And so I think that's really an example where the business kind of started in point A. We're a coffee business, we're doing our thing. We've been doing our thing for 10 or 15 years. And then with access to finance, with access to advisory to help them think about their business strategy going forward, they were able to introduce this whole new business line that's complementary to their coffee work and help bring farmers along with them on that journey, on a journey that will hopefully bring them to more climate resilience, as cocoa is better suited to the local climate conditions there.
We've had several questions come in around the role of agroforestry and kind of what opportunities we see in planting trees in a sustainable way to boost more resilient agroforestry. And then also some questions on the role of carbon sequestration and the difference from multi-story / shade-grown coffee farming compared to bulk kind of full sun coffee farming.
Great. Well, that last one is pretty technical, so I'll just briefly say that the literature does show that the carbon storage and sequestration rates for shade-grown coffee are significantly higher than full sun coffee. There's a lot of great data on agroforestry in general, on Project Drawdown's website, if people haven't clicked around there. There's some very extensive footnoting and citations happening, as well as data that's more specific to coffee from organizations like Conservation International and Rainforest Alliance, which do a lot of work in the agroforestry coffee space. So I encourage folks to look up the specific numbers there. But it is, the key takeaway is, yes, the more trees and the more diversity of trees that we see on a farm, the higher carbon storage and sequestration values we see, which is really important, obviously, for confronting climate change. And so we see this as critically important to our portfolio, to our climate work. We want to help businesses and farmers keep these trees on the landscape and add more trees where it's appropriate. And in fact, so again, at the end of the day, it's businesses and farmers who are really determining their path forward. We are there to help them on that journey, to provide guidance through advisory, to provide funding on the lending and philanthropy side. But we are not directly planting trees ourselves. We have been involved in many interesting conversations recently, particularly in Central America, where businesses are saying, you know, based on the risks that we're seeing, based on the increased drought, the higher temperatures, based on some of the climate resilience advisories, conversations we're having with certain clients in Nicaragua, for example, businesses are saying, we need to plant more trees. Farmers are seeing that planting more trees on their farm is going to really help them confront some of these challenges. It's going to lower the temperature on the farm. It's going to help them respond to some of these emerging risks. And so we're certainly seeing that happening in our portfolio. We're very supportive of that. And those are the types of conversations that we want to have going forward at a global level.
Great, and I just realized, wow, time is flying during the Q&A session. So I probably have maybe one more question for Lizzie and one more question for Nico. That gives us two minutes. But Lizzie first, how are we bringing a gender lens into our climate resilience work?
Yeah, so we, as hopefully many folks on this call know, we have a significant focus on gender and women's empowerment through all the work that we do. For more, there's a lot more information on our website about our Women in Agriculture initiative. For climate in particular, we know that women are some of the most vulnerable to climate shocks. They are uniquely vulnerable, unfortunately, in many cases, given long-standing issues of access to resources, access to decision-making, et cetera. And so that's something we really keep top of mind in our work. And for example, with our climate resilience advisory work, we are starting with disaggregated risk analysis of, okay, there are male and female members in the cooperative. Are they seeing different levels of climate risk? Because that's something we need to know from day one in order to make sure that we are responding to women's different realities and different needs as we talk about what adaptation looks like. Also, we, on the capital side, have been looking at climate resilience grants that are specifically targeted towards women. And so again, bringing women cooperative members, women managers into the room, saying, what do you see as the climate risks facing you? What do you see as opportunities to build your resilience? And how can we help you fund that? And so we've dispersed several gender-focused climate resilience grants in Central America, specifically to help women farmers with the unique challenges they're facing to climate change.
Great. I realize we're at the top of the hour now. Nico, the remaining question that I was going to throw to you, if you have 30 seconds, with what are the gaps or opportunities you see in the philanthropic space for funders to take more action? or what do funders need to do more of? If you can round us out with that. Quick answer.
That's a big one to
Easy
answer.
question.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here the whole day, the philanthropic space. Yeah, to add grant money as a blended instrument where commercial money is maybe too early or still too high risk, is to lower down risk to make sure that commercial money stays interested. And I think that's an approach that we try to take very much, also at the IKEA Foundation. It's not just to fund projects for the fun of funding projects, but it's really looking at what's behind and what's beyond the project to make sure that the service in itself that you want to establish remains available. And yeah, that's how we look at it, of blending in philanthropic money in other sources of money.
Great. Definitely our approach here at Root Capital too. So I think we can close now, just 1 minute over, but thanks everyone for joining. Again, if you had questions you didn't answer, that we didn't answer, Lizzie and Jessica's emails are up on the slide, and you can definitely send additional questions to us, and we'll also be sharing the recording of the webinar as well. So thanks everybody. Thanks Lizzie and Nico also for hosting us today.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all for listening, and bye-bye.